Hi crafty friends, Shana from ShanoukiArt. This is card number 9 in Full Deck Challenge 3. The prompt was pink and black splatter. For my constant, I'm using the postage stamps. I have 3. I will decide later which one I'm going to use. I then have collected all my pink items. I also have this flower that I really like. Maybe I'm going to use that. I also have a beautiful fussy cut flower from a digital kit, and then all my other pink elements. Of course, more than I need. And I may also use some floral rub-ons. My carry forward item from last week is going to be the butterfly. I just can't resist butterflies. I have this printed sheet of very pretty butterflies. They have a lot of beautiful colors. These 2 on the left have got a lot of pink, which I think will suit my theme. I'm going to fussy cut out both. I'm not sure yet which one I'm going to use. It all depends how my card looks and which one will suit the overall look. Once I've cut them out, I'm going to start with my overall theme of mini collage on my card. I mentioned in another video that I'm really loving stripes at the moment. And I happen to use mainly stripes in the card today. Using Mod Podge as my adhesive, I'm going to apply some to the face of the card and then apply my first piece of scrap paper. Pink and white stripes. I'm then going to also add a layer of Mod Podge over the paper. I always seem to add a layer of Mod Podge over my collage pieces. This has become a habit over time, but I do find it gives it a really nice finish, especially when you're adding wet mediums on top. But you don't have to use Mod Podge and you don't have to add it over your collage pieces. That is just what I do, but it's not mandatory. Here we go with a few more stripes. Although I have darker pieces of pink, I've stuck to sort of the lighter shades, not for any specific reason. It's just what drew me at that moment in time. You'll notice I've left the little spiral tears on these papers. I've torn this out of a spiral book. I love the additional texture it leaves and how the colors from underneath peep through those little holes. I have dried this first layer well. I'm just going to trim off the excess. I'm going to add a few more pieces of collage over this to add more interest and more variety. But I'm using the same papers, just adding more of them. To break up this big section of stripe, I'm adding a strip going down that does have some black text on, which picks up from the black color of the 9 of spades on the left. And then to create some balance, I'm adding some stripe on the left in the corner. Trying to see if I could use that large flower anywhere. I've placed one of my stamps down and now I'm placing my focal point just to see placement and how it may look, and then I decided to add my stamp at the very top. The stamp is obviously not going to be a focal point this week, it's just going to be part of the background. Let's dry this layer too. But before it dries totally, I'm going to add another small piece of collage just to the right of the stamp. I'm finding the stamp edge a little bit too definite and straight, and I want to soften that a little bit. The Mod Podge was still a bit wet, so I didn't apply anything additional. I stuck down the extra piece and now I'm going to dry it and trim off that excess. The card background is done. Now let's talk about paint splatter. I use acrylic paints for mine and something called black gesso, which is a Dina Wakley product that I have, but normal, inexpensive acrylic paint works perfectly. I have a little tub that I use to keep my acrylic paint in, only because I do so much splatter. I don't want to make a new portion every single time, so I keep it in a little container with a lid. I have the same for my white paint. So simply, all that splatter paint is watered down acrylic paint. And unfortunately, I don't have a secret ratio number of how much paint to water. I really do just eyeball it. I will try and explain how the texture should be. So in my little paint tub, I've added some of the black gesso and now I've also added some of the acrylic paint. The black gesso is much thicker. It comes out and actually keeps its shape when you squeeze it out of the little tube, whereas the acrylic paint is a bit more watery. You can use one or the other. I've used both only because my acrylic paint is actually running out. I'm then going to add some water to the tub. I'm using my spray bottle only because it's there and it's easy. You can also use a teaspoon. Add some water, probably about a teaspoon to start off with, and then use a paintbrush or a little stick to mix it around and get all the paint smooth and diluted. I'm adding more water. As I said, the gesso is actually quite thick, so I need a bit more water for this. Normally you don't need quite as much if you're using just acrylic paint. Now, you don't want it too watery or too thick. If it's too watery, the splatters will probably spread and bleed. If you make it too thick, then they'll be too gloppy and be big lumps of paint falling on your artwork. The only way I can explain the consistency is that it should be a little thicker than milk, but not quite as thick as cream. And honestly, this will take a few tries to get the consistency right. You will need to test it on a scrap paper and then maybe add more paint if it's too watery, or add more water if it's too thick. There is no perfect science to this. You just need to keep adjusting. And that's why I actually keep a little tub. So when I do get the consistency right, I do have quite a bit to see me through a few projects. Let's do some splatter tests on a scrap paper. Personally, I think a fan paintbrush works the best. Because the bristles are spread out, the paint spreads out and gives a more even distribution when you splatter. So I dip the brush into my paint. I scrape off the excess on the little container edge. I place the brush over my paper and then I tap it with my finger. Here you can see a little gloop of paint. This tells me that it's a little too thick still. I'm going to add a bit more water and stir that well. If you don't have a fan paintbrush, I would suggest then using a really small, thin paintbrush. You want to pick up a little bit of paint at a time so your splatters are small. I'm going to stir that additional water well, and then I'm going to do the same. Dip it in, and then I'm going to tap it with my finger as it goes over the paper. You can see the spots of splash are much bigger than the fan paintbrush, and you can try different paintbrushes to see what kind of splatter you get. I honestly wouldn't recommend a really thick paintbrush. I don't like using them. They pick up way too much paint, and you get these really big chunks of splatter which don't look great. Well, in my opinion. Or they hold the paint and don't release it in the splatter. Quick wipe down and a new piece of scrap paper to practice a little bit more. The more you practice, the better your splatter will become. Just to explain why I scrape off most of the paint on the edge of the container, if you leave too much paint on the brush, when you splash it, it's going to leave really big drops. Now, unless you want that for your project, I would scrape off some of it onto the edge so you get a finer droplet when you splatter. See, I'm still adding water. I'm trying to get the consistency right. And don't worry if you've added too much water, you can always add a bit more paint if it's too watery. I think I've got it just right here. See the fine splatter? There's some bigger drops and some smaller drops, but it's not big and clumpy. I see it is a little difficult to see the consistency of the paint because the color is black, so it's dark. I may try and explain again in another video, maybe using a lighter color, which is easier to see. The more paint you have on the paintbrush, the bigger the drops, the less paint, the smaller the drops. I hope that helped a little bit with explaining about splatter. And now I'm going to add the black splatter to my altered playing card. And yes, I do always test my splatter before I actually move onto the project. I'm not going to add too much. I don't want it too dark. But I am going to place my focal point butterfly just to see where the splatters are falling in relation to the butterfly. It will also help me decide where I will position the butterfly. Just a bit more splatter. Let me show you a close-up of the splatter. You can see all the droplets are flat, there's no gloopy paint, and the finish is pretty smooth. For additional contrast, I'm going to use my black fine liner pen, and I'm going to go all the way around the edge of the card with a hand-drawn line. It's not quite on the edge. It's about 1 or 2 millimeters in, and it is a little wonky, but I want it to look hand-drawn. Taking my butterfly focal point again, let's decide where it's going to go. I'm thinking it'll look great in the middle. The colors of the butterfly are really working well. I do feel though it needs a little bit more splatter at the top of the card so that the card is not bottom heavy. A few more tips about splatter. I would recommend not using a super absorbent paper like a homemade paper. Fabric also tends to absorb the droplets. Scrapbook paper is best. I would also not recommend book page paper. That tends to be very absorbent too. If you do want to use the homemade papers, the fabrics and the book pages, I would suggest adding a layer of Mod Podge over to help prevent the absorption of the paint into those mediums. Back to my butterfly, she's going to go into the middle. I feel though she needs something just behind her to help her pop. I have this pretty printed tissue paper. I'm going to tear a strip and then I'm going to create a paper ruffle. Running it under my sewing machine with white thread, we have this beautiful texture created. And that's going to go behind the butterfly. It's a little too long and that's okay. I'm going to cut off the bottom section. I'm trying to keep the threads by just tearing off the tissue paper. It's not going to work, so I'm just going to cut that down. I love that, and because the tissue paper is semi-transparent, you can see some of those black splatters shining through. I'm going to use craft glue to glue down my tissue paper ruffle and then a bit of craft glue on the middle of the butterfly. I'm not going to add glue to her wings as I want her wings to stick up off the page. For this card, I'm going to add a sentiment. I have these beautiful stickers. These are black with white text which go perfectly, and I'm just going to stick that down at the bottom just underneath the butterfly. Although this is a sticker, I am going to apply some glue so I can make sure it is sticking down on all those layers underneath. And then I'm going to finish that off again with my black fine liner, just going around the sentiment with that same freehand line like I did on the edge of the card. The prompt for next week's card is vintage and brown splatter. I really hope you enjoyed this video and were inspired to create your own cards and practice that splatter. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the little bell so you're notified every time I upload new content. Thanks for watching, happy creating, and I'll see you again soon. Bye.